I think I'll put a warning at the start of this podcast, which is warning: intelligent views are expressed at some point, which is not what the normal listenership would be expecting. Certainly not from me, anyway. Hi, this is Steve, aka @AllAnthar on Twitter, and here are some more of my gaming vexes. Hello, and welcome to another episode of My Gaming Vexes, where I chronicle my ongoing efforts to run or at least play all of the tabletop RPGs I've purchased in hard copy. This time, we're joined by the very talented Jon Hodgson as we take a look at Maskwitches of Forgotten Doggerland, designed by Jon and the team at Handiwork Games. Maskwitches was kickstarted over 7 days in late August 2022. The goal had been to raise £500, but the eventual total was just short of £22,000, with more than 500 backers, so the game had clearly struck a chord in the ttrpg community. Long-time listeners will know that I have a soft spot for games set in humanity's real or imagined prehistory. Previously, we've played through a series of the Verm RPG, published by Nocturnal. You can hear our thoughts on this game in episode 6. I also have Osprey's Paleomythic on my list of shame, in that it's yet to see play. So, Maskwitches had me at Doggerland, and combined with entrancingly weird art, I went all in on the Kickstarter. Using a very light single D6 mechanic, the game makes no secret of its narrative focus, but although the rules are light, the game includes a set of interesting systems to drive the story forward. For me, the questions of what do you do and how do you do it are clearly answered. This must be one of the shortest lead times from the hard copy hitting my shelf to seeing play. So far, I've run 2 one-shots, and I'm planning to run sessions at both the UK Games Expo in June and at Owlbear in September. At the time of recording, I have 2 slots available in my Sunday morning game expo, so if this episode piques your interest, you'll be more than welcome. Originally, I'd intended to include some examples of actual play in this episode, but as you'll hear, my version of Maskwitches has been hacked quite a bit to better suit my own preferences and the needs of convention play. So rather than give an inaccurate representation, I've left it to Jon to give his vision of the game and its intent. Those of you who follow Jon on social media will know that he's reflected on the role of AI tools in the creation of all of his games, and we covered this a little during this episode, or rather, Jon and Kay cover it whilst the rest of us look on in mute admiration. Before we start, we did experience some sound issues in recording this episode. I've tried to clean it up as best as I can, but I hope it doesn't spoil things too much for you. And with that in mind, get ready. First of all, welcome to everybody, and a special welcome to Jon Hodgson, who's going to talk to us about Maskwitches and other such experimental role-playing type activities. Thanks for joining us, Jon. We've had accomplished people like yourself on the podcast before, and some of them even come back more than once. So hopefully it won't be too horrible an experience for you. Jon, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what was the first game you ever played, first role-playing game?
A half-hearted attempt to play, I think it was Holmes D&D, I think, but I didn't understand it at all. I was about 9 and I just didn't understand it at all. And then stumbled into like the Tiger Man, actual role-playing game. And then on to Dragon Warriors, very typical UK role-playing game route of sort of, paperback size role-playing games, and then on to at secondary school it was on to D&D and RuneQuest and all sorts. Basically, you name it, we probably played it at some point.
Yeah,
okay. Before it was available in 1840, whenever that.
And I suppose more relevant to what we're going to be talking about this evening, which is Maskwitches. What's your favourite prehistoric artifact?
Oh, it's a very difficult question, isn't it? Well, not that many of them, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things. I don't think they really have names, but there was a bunch of thick tools that a friend of mine who's helped out with the research. He sent me a load of images of those. It's really beautiful things. I mean, you could almost pick any end of the handmade, net and tools that you find in the archaeology. There's amazing objects. Mostly followed by the antler platelet star car. They're actually thought to be mass, with holes in these pieces of deer skull. And I came across it way after I started doing Maskwitches, which is nice. I always love it where you do the research back to front, and you find it's more than this research. So it's probably my answer to that.
Fantastic. Kay, tell us a little bit about you and what's your favourite prehistoric artefact?
Oh, God, no pressure. Well, hi, I'm Kay, also known as @K_0 on Twitter. I'm an academic working in concept art and a major grognard. I had to go and look up some prehistoric artifacts before this session, I'm not going to lie, because I was like, what counts as prehistoric? Because my understanding of history, prehistory, or anything is really rubbish. But I was very pleased to see that the Venus of Willendorf actually counts. So if you haven't seen one of the prehistoric Venuses, they're these little hand-carved women, and they're very chunky, these kind of weird little sort of misshapen fat women. And the reason why I like them is because I think most recently historians have decided that actually the reason why they look like this is because if you look at them from the top down, from a woman's perspective, that's what a woman's body looks like. So it's almost certainly carved by women rather than being something that was a man thing. So so the Venus of Willendorf is my favourite artifact.
That's very cool. I like it. Okay.
I'm Neil Hopkins, so Thermal Satsuma on Twitter and Satsuma Dice Camp on the Mastodon site, which is very appropriate for this. My favourite prehistoric artifact is the beakers of the Beaker people. So I thought that was a marvellous idea. I remember hearing about that at school and thinking things like that can persist, and that's all we know about them, or that's what they base the knowledge on. These wonderful clay beakers have survived to the present day. So it's very evocative artifact.
Absolutely.
Such a simple thing, but so useful.
Associated with Stonehenge, isn't it? Though, like burial.
Yeah.
Weren't they?
Hello, everyone. Marty Cookson. So mcookie123 on Twitter. Right. So I went to the Stonehenge exhibition at the British Museum last year, and so my new favourite artifact, not sure if it fully classes as prehistoric, would be the oldest star chart, which is the one that I think it's nearly 4,000 years old. So it's not really prehistoric, but it's ancient, and I think it was found in Germany.
Yes.
And it's absolutely stunning. Like, looks completely modern. So that, I think, in terms of like genuine prehistoric stuff, I guess I've travelled quite a lot in the Middle East. And so some of the stuff you find in the antiquities museums in Tehran, or somewhere like that, they just go like 10,000, 12,000 years old, and there's like the little clay bulls that have somehow survived. Those are probably the oldest thing I've seen.
That's amazing, isn't it? Yeah, that sort of stuff. Okay. I think all that counts as prehistoric in my book anyway.
So yes, I'm Neil Benson, known as at Old Scouser RPing on Twitter. I guess my choice isn't anywhere near as well researched or well informed as anybody else's, and because we're kind of dealing with a fictional prehistoric period, I'm going for the femur as used by the apes in 2001. A very practical piece of prehistoric equipment. You can bash your opponent's skulls in with it. So that's my choice.
Bit stereotypical of you there, Neil, but we'll go with that anyway.
Well, I'm sticking to form, Steve. Sticking with what I know.
Good stuff. All right. For me, my sort of favourite is the stone hand axes that were carved and sort of travelled all around Europe during the Neolithic and the Neolithic period. They're just beautiful, and the fact that they so moved so far afield shows how connected the prehistoric world was. It wasn't people living in caves, and again, that Stonehenge exhibition really drives that. Anyway, okay, so John, coming to you, how did Maskwitches arise as a concept? Because you launched the Kickstarter, and it was only a week long, wasn't it? But it was incredibly successful. What was it that drove you to do it?
Yeah, the project kind of came out of nowhere, really weirdly. I was messing around with Midjourney, and it's hard to remember when this was a very experimental thing. So much has happened in the last year around that whole issue, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, and AI art. But way back in sort of the first quarter of last year, it was a really weird experimental tool that you had to be invited to use. And it wasn't a business at this point, Midjourney. It was, well, I mean, I assume behind the scenes it was a business, but it wasn't like a money-making kind of subscription thing. It was an invite model. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'd been introduced to this by another artist, Mike Francino, who works at Blizzard, who I've known for years and years. Mike is a really good guy. And we had already been messing around with Midjourney for the rule book that powers Maskwitches. It's called The Silver Road. And we'd already pulled that together. And more and more I was finding these sort of weird artifacts were coming out of Midjourney, and I was sort of mining this rich vein of these weird looking things. It pretty much came whole cloth. The name just popped out of nowhere as a sort of funny name for a game, almost like imagine if there was a game called this, and then you go, oh no, that's actually I want to do that game. That's a good idea for a game. And I'd mentioned before there's been some sort of laughing at the name online that it's a really bad name, but I kind of like it for that.
I think it's a great name.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. I think it's it's very of the game, if you know what I mean. You know, it is what it is, and it's almost in this particular project. If I compare it to something like Beowulf, where we first set up the games company, Handiwork Games, and we were quite rigorous in deciding what were we good at, what were we interested in, what would be good to, what would sell, right? What could we make that would be a viable product to start the company. This one just sort of happened. Like I rarely felt in control of it creatively. It wrote itself very much. So yeah, it was quite exciting in that from that perspective, how that came together.
I'm just interested because I mean, you talked about Starcar and your awareness of that particular artifact came after you'd sort of written the game. Did you have an interest in sort of prehistory? I'm assuming you must have done, just the thing to start to evolve.
In a very general sense, yeah, but it's been really interesting. How I tend to work with projects like this is I tend to read like mad. I get interested in something, and at some point I should probably seek out a diagnosis, because I'm one of those people that has to just read everything that I can lay my hands on, around this. So I didn't know I was aware of Doggerland, that this is sort of the territory that's now North Sea, and I was aware of that because it's just, I don't know, almost like a sort of schoolboy thing. I don't know, just it's one of those cool phenomenons. And I was aware, people used to live there, and they find, finds are washed up on beaches, and fishermen pull stuff up in nets and so on. And I just thought that was really interesting. And then it sort of flooded, and then no longer obviously accessible. And I liked the name Forgotten Doggerland because of that. But a very general interest. I think there's a book, After the Ice, by Stephen Mithen, and I'd read that, and that kind of pointed towards some stuff, and I'd picked up bits and bobs here. I mean, I'm super history nerd. I'm interested in all kinds of, pretty much early medieval period backwards really is my cup of tea.
It's your thing.
So it
sounds like it was a confluence of sort of the Midjourney stuff there, and then you've got this general interest in history, plus you've got this sort of this system, this experimental role-playing system, and it just seemed to come together. And it, as you say, the Kickstarter, you launched it, and then it only ran for a week. And I can remember when it came up, and it was just, we'll see what happens, and if it doesn't back, just almost like you just threw it out there and to see what would happen.
Well, yeah, because it didn't seem like it was, it's pretty niche, right? I mean, it's like, it is a sort of experimental story game thing. It's not a 5e book. You know what I mean? It's asking quite a lot of people to play games like this, if they're not already interested in that kind of thing. A very, very niche topic, but to find its feet on Kickstarter, it did very well in a week. It's great. Really pleased with that.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, because one of the things I was thinking about, I'll let other people say something in a second, sorry. Whereas it'll come out in the edit. I'll sound much more generous in the edit than I do. But because one of the questions was, why the Paleolithic, why that sort of period of history rather than Neolithic and stuff, although you are obviously come to Stonehenge, and we'll talk about that later because that is the Neolithic. But it sounds like it's in like, oh, this is interesting, let's put it together and just see what happens. But I think, sometimes the very best things come from that, don't they, in some way?
Yeah, sort of happy accident stuff, I guess. And I mean, it has to be Mesolithic because of Doggerland goes underwater pre-Neolithic. So that was just, and stuff happened there. So there was not much choice there. That and I didn't know a lot about Mesolithic at the time, and I was really, really interested in. Oh, do you know something I forgot? And I must go through. I mean, I've got about 20 books on the period now, and I must go through because there was a beautiful line in an introduction to one of them, and I should have written down which book it was in, so I can't edit anyone until I do that work. That talks about how deep history is a really brilliant kind of canvas on which to project quite radical ideas, and I've always been interested in that in terms of politically radical. That deep history and particularly with, like we see in the Mesolithic, live a very different kind of life, and you can talk about different kinds of society and so on. Which is that it's not really sort of core to the book, but it's not like it's got a message. Do you know what I mean? It's not proselytizing anything, but I like the idea of looking of life. I think that's a really interesting thing for role playing games to muck about with. So yeah, that's all in there too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just say it's a really evocative setting. But as you say in the book, it's all sort of speculative, and you're drawing from other sources. So how did you go about that? Of where did you sort of get the inspirations to build this culture from?
There's a lot came from. I mean, I think it's a really important question. Any kind of role playing games design about what do the players do, right? Because it's sort of, you immediately have sort of ideas of this quite evocative kind of weird, where we've got a lot of options for beliefs to be very different, and it needed some sort of hook for players to do, so that made some sort of sense out of the game part of it, I guess. So a lot of that comes from asking questions about what players do in a game, and sort of battling the. So in the game, I should explain what the heck you do in the game. So in the game, you play the eponymous Maskwitches of Forgotten Doggerland, who are completely, created whole cloth order of weird sort of social workers who, when there are problems within the hunter-gatherer community, manifest as evil spirits, and the Maskwitches are there to battle those spirits. They're sort of skilled in the ways of battling these spirits and solving the issues in the community, and sort of putting those evil spirits to rest. There's an interesting sort of twist, if you want to pursue it, where possibly the Maskwitches are as kind of visionary, if you like, as the evil spirits are. That they're both generated by the community, and they're both sort of fictional, and they're almost sort of therapy for hunter gatherers. It's quite weird, isn't it? This game.
I love that. That's really cool. That's really
a great idea.
All right, and I think it's only on TikTok, or might be on our YouTube as well. I was telling the story the other day. I was really stuck on part of it, writing it, because sometimes it flowed really well for quite a long time, and then once you get quite a lot down, then you get stuck on things because you've got to be a little bit more precise once you've got a lot of material in the can. And I wasn't quite sure. Again, I don't want to talk. Because in the Silver Road, your character is defined by good at two things. And in the Maskwitches version, the two things you're good at are masks that your character wears that sort of represent an ability, and you have two amulets that represent things you're bad at. And I was thinking, and they can swap them around. The masks, certainly the characters. And I'm stuck on, but who are the people then? Who are the Maskwitches as people? Because their identities can be completely changed by swapping masks. And that, it's almost a sort of Blade Runner. Are they even real at all? Just, that came out. I was chatting to Nigel. I don't know if you know Nigel Clark. I was chatting to him, walking the dog, and amazingly, I don't believe in like sort of woo stuff at all. I'm really cynical as a person, and I found this. I found a piece of flint on this walk, and there isn't naturally occurring flint out where we are. It's all hardcore for the path. And there was a bit of flint, and I picked it I knew what to do. And I was like, oh no, that's like hideously like sort of superstitious and nonsense, isn't it? You know, don't ever tell anyone that story.
Sorry, no one listens to this anyway. So I wouldn't worry.
Yeah. But,
So it sounds like you started with this, it's history, your interest in history and prehistory that drove the idea for the game. Well, what point did you kind of go, from a system point of view, this is going to be something experimental, something I've never done before, because there's a few kind of prehistoric games out there that I think perhaps are more traditional from a system point of view. So what was that point, or what led you to that decision?
So I guess I was probably before the Silver Road game, so put out the similarly weird names, which is a sort of 1930s but kind of very Peaky Blinders inspired stuff. And again, interestingly, sort of quite the in Spoons in Knives is a line from a sort of radical poem, Pylon Poet's poem, and again, sort of interest in a sort of social, political stuff has always been there in the Silver Road games, which is kind of weird. I don't know why, just is just the way it worked, I think. So I was looking around for ideas for that, and this just seemed to fit really well because it was kind of weird and not completely sensical. Is sensical a word? I don't think it is. It's only nonsensical because it's a bit nonsensical. It's it was a good fit.
Yeah,
and you already because the rules are quite well, as you know, they're very sort of light and ask quite a lot of the players. It seemed like a good fit. It seemed like something that would fit. And also another big factor was I'd actually spent 2 years writing Beowulf stuff non-stop for 5e, and I really wanted a break. Not from 5e as such, but just to do something like a palate cleanser kind of thing, where you can get a bit deep into repetitive ways in which rules work, right? And 5e's cool for what it is, but it's nice to do something else,
We'll come back to the point about experimental age because I've got some questions about that as well. But
I think for me, what and it's something, John, you just said about how easily it flowed to write it. And I think that really comes through. When I was reading it, it read really easily. And
good.
And it was one, it just kind of all seemed to fit together. And in my head, I was already thinking about, well, how would this work around the table sort of thing. So I guess it's not, I don't want to be one of those people who says it's not a question, it's more of an observation. But I suppose the question would be, like, how long did it take you, do you think, to kind of write the bulk of it? When did you put it down and sort of say, right, that's it, I've now got the form of it?
Now I can tell you because the other day I screenshotted, I believe on my phone, the first post I made on Facebook so it was the 23rd of June last year when I first sort of coined the title or shared the title. And I know I'd been working on it for a week at that point because I didn't want to be, a lot of people, I'm making a game about this. And it's like, you're not though, are you? You're just telling people you are. So I didn't want to do that because it seemed like a good idea. So I'd been working for a week. And that was the middle of June. And then I did a little bit of writing after the Kickstarter. So I was just going to look up, when did the Kickstarter finish? Does anyone else find this like post-COVID time is completely like impossible?
I backed it, as you know, because I kept annoying you because I didn't pay the postage for my the cards. So,
was that you?
That was me, yeah. Well, I'm sure it wasn't just me. I'm sure there were other people there as well.
Yeah, no, it was.
It was just me. Okay, fair enough.
It wasn't just you. August the 25th. So yeah, pretty quick then, actually.
That's really quick.
Yeah. Luminek.
Wow.
How does that? It is. I don't want to sound completely nuts on here, but it's very strange, right? Because it came together. So, don't know. Yeah, one of those ones, and I get it. Occasionally, I've had with painting. I think I've in my career, which is probably 25 years, I've probably, in my own estimation, done painting that I think are good paintings, and they work the same way. They just like you go, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing, and then you just do it. So yeah, weird, eh?
It just flows.
Yeah, I mean that really comes through. That came through for me when I read it, and I think what that led on to was the fact that I kind of the purity of vision of it. Like it was quite. There was no fat on it. It was all kind of. You definitely got a sense of this is exactly what you want it to look like. and that made it quite an enjoyable read. And not all games are enjoyable reads.
I think my question is probably going to segue nicely into rules, because Martin's just talked about the beautiful flow of the book, and it really does flow when you read it. And that concept of flow, I think, is really big. And that sort of brought me into the concept of rhythm, and the rhythms that are such a big part of the game, particularly, the sort of natural rhythms, but the rhythms of sort of, human voices and chanting and things like that. And I'm just wondering how, when did the rhythms come into the game, John? Was that something that was there at the beginning, or was that one of those kind of more sort of smaller details that you had to come back to and put in a little bit later?
It quickly became apparent that there's various schools of thought about how people in deep history saw things differently or experienced life differently, and this idea that space could be measured in rhythms rather than the idea that we imagine a two-dimensional map of territory. For example, when we imagine going from one place to another place, we imagine it very much as a two-dimensional drawing, a map, and so on. But none of that has been, thought of at this point in history. Well, potentially, we don't know. And I find that sort of stuff absolutely fascinating. That there are completely different ways of having time. And just read. I annoy myself when I do this. I just read. There's a book called Kindred about Neanderthals. Who's the author's name I've forgotten, and see it because I always like to give credit where it's due. Absolutely fantastic book. Nothing to do with what I'm doing, which is why I'm annoyed that I read it, because it's not helping me, and I've got loads of books about the Neolithic to read instead. That also touches on ideas of space and community and rhythm and just different ways of seeing and being. I think also I did in my misspent youth, I did university and a fine art degree, and there's a lot about seeing and ways of seeing, all that, and that is always fascinating. So as soon as I seized on that, because I just thought it was really interesting, really sort of alien, that I love the fact that people that live in Doland are not really related to us in any great way. This is a group of people who I mean, there's still genetic material floating, but not very directly, and they're not like us. And I thought that was really interesting. That stuff, really, it all comes together in that book. All of those sort of weird interests that I have, which is good. Yeah, but I don't. So the other question is, I've avoided giving. I think about a quarter of the way into it, that came out the reading, and was just absolutely fascinating, and seemed like something I never read in a role-playing game before, and continues to elude people.
Because I think when you're playing a role-playing game, or certainly when you're running it and you're trying to sort of set a scene, I think if you've got a few hooks which show the otherness of the world that you're trying to depict. So when I ran it, I ran it twice now. I'm down to run it again at UK Games Expo. But it's the same. Okay, this is as you move through the landscape, it's not about maps, it's about rhythms. And so you have a song which tells you how to get to where the flint's found, or you've got a different song which tells you where the fish can be caught. And trying to sort of pound that home, I think that seemed to be a good way to sort of set the scene. And the other thing as well I just wanted to throw in was that because obviously you're very careful. There's really quite a robust section talking about this is not about cultural appropriation and that sort of thing. And I think when you're talking about songs, I think you tend to think about the song lines with the Indigenous Australian peoples. Obviously, you're really careful to sort of draw a distinction, which I thought was well done, really.
It was a weird project as well, because during the making of it, and I think this was one reason it was successful on Kickstarter, I just talked about it on my personal Facebook page. Didn't talk about it on the work page. Arguably, big mistake. It should have been being chatted about on the Handiwork Games Facebook page. But I did, because it was quite sort of fragile, as it was, and at any point I could have just gone, no, this doesn't work, and stopped. So I kept it to my personal page. And there was one point I realised I had to length at the time. When making all these images of drums, because that seemed like, that seemed really obvious, right? There's a big section of the book talking about the use of the word shaman and shamanism, which I did not want to use. I won't bore everyone talking too much about that. But it suddenly struck me that drums are really connected with shamanic practice, shamanism, and in particular, really started and neighbours shaman, which is true meaning of the original meaning of the word shaman, shamanism, and it shouldn't be that. It's not of that tradition. And I think there are prehistoric games out there that just gleefully grab on all that stuff and just put it into a game. And anything, I noticed Osprey are about to publish a tabletop war game, skirmish game set in Doggerland, and probably word the forgotten folklore of Doggerland. I thought, oh, it's nice to be influential. But the dream catcher on the cover, and you're like, what the goodness is that doing there? You know, that yeah. I mean, I want to be kind to the people involved. You know, this is a preoccupation rather than anyone else's. But if you're really wanting to, I didn't want to work in a shorthand. Oh, it's a bit like this. And sometimes people send me go like this because this is about these bush people from South Africa, and it's like, no, and that's not quite. That is in the realms of cultural appropriation. Yeah, not what the way I want to do it. You know, I mean, again, I'm trying to be careful because there are a lot of ways to skin a cat, and I'm not the arbiter of what's right for people. But for me, I just did not want to do that sort of graphic stuff. Does not appeal to me.
So. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
But that air of universality, though, of oral histories and sort of storytelling within not within the game, but within the culture and within the setting, and time being something that you measure with song, I thought was really strong, and it didn't. I think you really managed to capture that sense without it feeling like any one particular culture, but at the same time feeling very believable and something that we could sort of latch onto in the gameplay as well as we were playing. I think that came across very strongly.
Good. Thank you. Well, there's a sort of scary part in it for me where it's interesting when you say earlier about there being no fat on it. It does ask, the way the game plays does ask a lot of players, as I've already mentioned, and it's trying to get the balance right where you sort of set up some dominoes for people, but allow them and try and make a positive experience to add their own. So there's enough, you're trying to hint at a thing, that go, you probably know what this is, or I've explained enough that you can add to it and I want to let you get on with that. And that's really nice to hear that it sounds like you've found your way to it. I worry that am I filling in too much, by paring it right back? Is it just in my head? Book and it's not on the page, which is like doing anything,
Of course. Let's turn to rules then, because obviously you talk about it as being experimental, and sort of my question was, I mean, when you say experimental, are you saying it's a work in progress that you're just giving it a go, or is it experimental in as much as it's meant to enable experimentation on the part of the sort of the players and the person running the game?
Yeah, more that second one, more. It is quite unusual, I think, in terms. I mean, there are other games that do similar things and work similar ways. I wanted to set out the stall really clearly, so that no one would be too shocked by how minimal the system is and how much it requires of the players. And that's why I call it a story game. I don't want anyone to be expecting a sort of BRP. Kind of set up, because it isn't that kind of game. So that's about setting out a nice clear stall so people aren't disappointed that it's nothing like what they thought it would be. And again, like we've played it a lot. I played a lot of games of the Silver Road system, and it works for us. And it's been play tested with various groups that all seem to get into it, and seem to enjoy it, and various people have responded very positively to it. But it's probably not for everyone, right? It's definitely not for everyone.
If this is your first role-playing game or story game picking it up, I think again everyone's different, but I suspect that some people might struggle with the lack of sort of structure, because
no, I know what you mean. It does rely on you already being aware of kind of role-playing games as an activity. And I think I don't think you sort of. I can't recall if you go through this as a role-playing game type stuff. I think you just almost say, well, assume that people are going to at least have an idea of it. And
I think personally speaking, I quite like the enables experimentation side of things, because everyone on this call knows that when I'm running games, I tend to mess about with the rules anyway. So, so when I run it, I need to put a little bit more. It's not crunch is the wrong word, but a bit. So, for example,
I know
like,
what you mean,
levels of health. A little. You're well, or you're injured, or you're damaged, or whatever it might be. And I just felt that I needed to put a bit more into it, but it doesn't take away from the validity of the underlying system. And it's just that's what I'm comfortable with. And if I'm running one shot, so especially with people who maybe have never played it before, for me, I need to have a few hooks to hang things on. But I say it's horses for courses, really.
Well, one thing I found with the masks and the amulets, that it seemed quite difficult to get a mask roll to succeed. I think I tried multiple times to light a fire as my mask skill.
That was an amulet roll, wasn't it? The one things you're bad at.
Yeah, no, that was a thing. That was the thing I was bad at, and trying to get that to work. And and you think rolling a 6, you'd probably get it more often than that. But when I actually succeeded, it was fantastic. So that was a nice mechanic. It felt frustrating, and then I see that that's quite a nice way to do that,
because there's so many different ways as well you can sort of handle that we've seen in different groups. That some folks I've seen that will play it quite strategically in that they're making sure people that have some sort of tangentially related ability, to do a thing they make sure they'll be the people lighting the fires, if you know what I mean. But other people will just go, no, this is part of the story, if you know what I mean. Part of this story is that the fire was difficult to light, and then that's what happened this time. Which again, different folks sort of take that on in different ways. I know I've had long chats with some people that are very frustrated by that, and they want to play a game where people are average at things, and there's like 50-50, and why isn't there 50-50 in it? And I'm just not interested in that at all. I have to rewatch myself because I don't want to be too flippant. But it's
I'm one of those people. So when I ran it, I sort of said, if obviously you've got things you're really good at, which chances are you'll never fail, and then obviously got the amulets. And I said everything else is 50-50. You just roll the dice.
So you've never played Maskwitches of Forgotten Darkland?
Again, I don't know. It's probably just me. It's just having to fill space that's meant to be there in the rules. So when characters took consequences, that's when they got flint naps, just because it was like a bit of a quid pro quo thing. But you guys that played in my game, you didn't play Maskwitches, you played Steve's version.
No, you played really.
Yeah, I'd love to play Maskwitches.
Appallingly compromised.
Yeah.
Oh dear, I've broken it.
All of those lovely flip naps that I had hoarded by the end of the game, thinking that I might be able to spend them in the big finale, is something entirely made up by you, Steve. I am quite disappointed.
The flint naps thing is a perfectly legitimate way to do it. I think that's really good. A good thing for the GM to do is in the lot of failures, give out some naps. I think that works really well. So that bit's fine. The 50-50 that's just shocking. It's upsetting to me. I'm joking.
Pandering to needy players. That's all it is. Like this, like this.
Do you know? There's another funny aspect of this. A bit like the setting as a whole. That's like weird. Thinking about the way that the Silver Road works. That so if you're bad at it, you only succeed when you roll a 6, and if you're good at a thing, you only fail if you roll a 1, and then on your next go, you succeed at the thing you failed at. Right? Yeah. And I start thinking about. Because sometimes people say to me, it's not realistic. And to be honest, I'm not remotely interested in that. But how, like, an average person at, say, picking locks, how good is an average person at picking locks? Well, not at all, they can't do it. None of us, I suspect, know how to pick a lock at all. So an average person, how good would they be at it? And then on the flip side, if you're playing a game where, say, you've got a fighting ability of like 30%, would you fight to the death with swords if, like, you won 30% of fights? I know it's sort of, at the table it works a bit different than that. But I'd started thinking down those sort of, down those alleys, and you start to get, it goes all a bit weird. But it's quite good because it sets up a different way of looking at how games work, and
what I thought was interesting. So the dice rolling aside, and I do like a game that just uses a single D6. I think that's kind of quite an elegant thing. But it's more the structure of the game, really, and you know the I can't remember what it's called, but the tracker. So you know,
predestined event tracker.
Yeah, each time you roll,
That's so cool.
I think that's really interesting because as players, you know, you can see your roles have as well as determining the current thing you're doing. You know, you can see things potentially unfolding before you. But I think that the whole structure of the game, it kind of almost felt like, you know, with role-playing games, traditional role-playing games, I guess you might say, they tend to be very, very free-form. And this was more like maybe like a Forged in the Dark kind of game where there's more structure around, you know, well, this is the way it's going to happen. And unless this is specifically Steve's version of Maskwitches, in which case, you know,
it's my interpretation of Maskwitches, but that way.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. And do you know what? In the being momentarily serious about it, if you change the way that task resolution mechanic works, it doesn't really matter, right? You know, just to do it the way that suits you. Totally. Obviously, you know, I hope that's a given. You know what I mean? If that's what your group wants to do, and it helps your game be good, then by all means, you know, and it's your game. But yeah, that structured approach is, yeah, that's quite important to it. I think I really like that. We'll alternate actually when we're playing different games. Sometimes, so there's predestined events where when, say, a 4 has been rolled a number of times around the table, a given thing happens. And sometimes we let everyone see what those are, which can be really good. If you've got the right sort of players that don't mind that quite meta kind of play, you know, and it's stuff like, you know, when 4s have been rolled, someone dies, you know, and it's not, you know, it's not like a character necessarily, unless you want it to be. I was talking the other day, mind you, talk about the whole thing about consequences, you know, very common consequence when you fail a roll, you get a sort of prompt to guide the narrative. Someone is hurt is a common one, you know, sort of combat type situation or, you know, dangerous situation. Someone said we were playing a game of the 1930s in Knives and Spoons. I was playing, I wasn't GMing, and my character got hurt, or I got to narrate that somebody was hurt. And I decided it was going to be my character. I decided I was killed in the opening scene of the game. And everyone was like, oh, shit. And it really set the scene for sort of what kind of story it was going to be, right? Because you can do it. And then, of course, you can, I just took on an NPC. Immediately he became, you know, one of the characters. And it was so good. It was, you know, really, really, because it was like, what? Like proper dead? Like, yep. You know, head blown clean off. So yeah, all of that stuff I think works really nicely in it. But you do need the right kind of players, and they need to be invested in that kind of play.
Yeah, I guess it's being more invested in the story or the, you know, what's going on at the table rather than your individual character. You know.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think in terms of structure as well. So obviously you got that things like the event tracker and that type, which sort of drives sort of events, obviously. But then you've got so as you said, the Maskwitches, they've got a certain set of tools in their toolkit to defeat these spirits. So it's you know, they might create witch knives, or they might go to a turf hall where the myths of the peoples are recorded in there, which might have information about the name. But there's various locations, okay, and then there are journeys to get there, and we sort of randomized how many obstacles, you know, you'd have to overcome to get to a certain place.
Cool.
But a lot of it was about journeys and then activities to get what you need from the location. So there was a lot of rhythm and a level of repetition, and repetition is not necessarily a bad thing, but that there was that rhythm behind the game itself, which I think, you know, coming to what Neil was saying about that's a lot of Forged in the Dark time games have that procedural type approach to it. And is that how you play it when you're playing it in your own group?
Yeah, definitely. And I was going to ask you actually, one thing, I had a question for you guys. One thing that keeps me awake at night sometimes if I'm thinking about Maskwitches is the one thing I think that it goes really light on as a game is how do the players know what Maskwitches do? And the implicit sort of idea is you can, if you know the options that you've got, you kind of need to read the book, I think is probably the answer. But you've got a sort of set of activities that witches do. You could also make up your own. I hope the game would empower you entirely to make up your own versions of things you might do to defeat a spirit, or to get to find the necessary knowledge to overcome that spirit. But I do wake up in the middle of the night sometimes thinking, what if people just go, well, I don't know what to do. I'm not a Maskwitch of Forgotten Dogland. What am I supposed to do? And that, so I don't know, how did you get on with that? Was it like, did you kind of, Steve, did you prompt them a bit to what they could do, or?
Well, I'll throw it open to them first of all, because I know what I did, but whether the bit came across the players or not is a different matter. So,
well, I think what Steve did, how I felt it worked, was that what Maskwitches do is intrinsically connected to the community that they are attached to. And so every task that we tried to do or got involved in was something that the community wanted or looked to us for kind of help. And I think, and that's a fairly tight, that's better than we all meet in a tavern. Your community actually calls upon you, sometimes in fear, sometimes in trepidation, sometimes demanding, but whatever their stance, they're calling you to do on you to do something. So I think it's relatively straightforward. What Maskwitches do is they support the community, and Steve did that very nicely. I think.
I think it's that part of the weird balance of trying to leave space for players to come up with, to be creative, within sort of framework, but without it being too heavy. And you don't know, do you? When it might make sense to the creator of the game, but it might not make sense to anyone else.
What we've got is representative of two different play groups here. So Martin, Neil H, and K were in the first time I ran it, and that was virtually, okay. And then Neil B was in a second session, and what I did was in the first group, there's a lot of, we did run the meat spoiler. In that, there's a lot of setup, it's like social interaction, and I felt it was great, but it took a lot of took time out of the session we had. So we had like a 3.5 hour slot. So when I ran it for the group Neil, it was and that was a face-to-face group. It was a lot more right. Here's your, this is the spirit that's come up. This is the situation. It's spoiling the meat. As Maskwitches, you can do this, and this type of activity. What do you want to do? And then it was very much about, okay, we're going to go to visit the Everwitch, and then it was okay. It's the journey, how you got there. And it was all about the consequence that built up, and the predestined event tracker sort of drove some of the sort of the detail, the granularity in terms of what happened, if that makes sense. So my approach to it evolved actually between the two groups.
From our table, it did feel quite clear. You set up really nicely. Explained what the Maskwitches, or the kind of people they were, and the relationship with these villagers and the spirits in particular. And then you presented us with some options, Well, I say you presented, I think it was kind of through the NPCs, but it became clear that, there were different things we could do. There was go and speak to the Everwitch. There was a painting cave. There was, when we were making a dagger and so on, there was kind of stages to the game as well. So it didn't feel to me like it was an RPG where you kind of like a total sandbox where you go, well, we're going to go we're going to go down this route. It was kind of clear, the cues that were there. So I thought it worked pretty well from that point of view. Like I felt like we knew what we were meant to do. We knew how to use the masks and the amulets and so on, and but
that works really well as a framework. I think the masks and the amulet framework is so simple, and because it's only, I think we have 2 and 2, didn't we? 2 masks and 2 amulets, and you've got this kind of square grid of who you are. What I really liked about the game that we played with Steve online is that because he'd sorted the mask and amulets into, hadn't you sorted them into sort of physical and mental and?
Yes, it's me messing around the rules. Mind, body, spirit. So
mind, body, spirit.
Use to draw masks from whichever, so they could decide where their character strengths were. Sorry, Kay.
And that was just really good for a one shot, even though it took some time to invest in that, because it meant that we could have an idea of, do I feel that I can play a physical character in this, or a character who's going to have a much more of a spiritual skill set. And it meant that for someone like me who was a little bit new to the whole thing, was like, I don't know what kind of character I can play. I've only got a one shot in which I can create this character. There's not going to be any time for me to work out a character arc or anything like that. I need to get a kind of a beat or some kind of a hook for my character. And it was actually really easy to do that. And what I really liked is that because we all showed each other what skills that we had, and we were all really open with our masks and our amulets, meant that you could very quickly get an idea of who you were within the group of the Maskwitches, and who would be good at a particular thing and who wouldn't. And John, you mentioned earlier about how some players were really strategic about this, and I guess that we kind of weren't that strategic, but it allowed Neil H, for example, to have this firelighting story arc that was hilarious. It was absolutely brilliant. And the idea was that, look, we all know you're really bad at firelighting. Let someone else light the fire. And he was going, no, I'm going to learn as I'm making it. And this was just great. This is the kind of thing that, can turn a one shot into a short campaign or something like that, where you can, right from the start, there were some character hooks that were there that we could build on if we wanted to. And I thought that's why the framework was really elegant.
I thought the randomization of the skills worked well as well. And I'm reading the book, all the random tables are fantastic. Yes. I love a good table in a game.
Yeah.
I love a table.
I was just going to make exactly the same point as Neil. That's what one of the things I think that really made reading it come alive was that the random tables, you could straight away say, gosh, there's a lot of replayability here. So from quite a simple, Maskwitches help the community, roll 4 or 5 d6 and you've got the whole story mapped out there. Run another 4 or 5 d6, you've got exactly the spirit identity you're up against. It's just fantastic and just really, really sort of user-friendly and accessible.
Do you know what I was going to say to sort of balance out? Because, I don't like compliments. To deflect compliment. I'm really glad to hear, actually, you've had such a great time with it. You could look at, I was feverishly looking, I've got the book here, because you forget things, especially if you've spent ages editing it, whatever, you forget sometimes things about the book. And I couldn't remember whether in the final book, the different good and bad aspects, if you like, they're actually grouped. A cynical person might be able to spot which D&D stats that those groups of 6 good and bad at things relate to, which I had a bit of a sort of crisis of faith about, where you go, really? Is that what you're doing, John? That these are all basically strength, dexterity,
The look behind the curtain there. That's it.
Yeah, I know. It's this pitifully cynical reskin of D&D. No, is it? Heck. But that was quite interesting to think. That was quite a challenge to myself, because that's a way you can group those abilities. And it's, I'd like to think that's useful for players for exactly the reasons you're talking about, where you can imagine, oh, well, I'd like to be a character who's a bit like this, and those breaking down things that people do into those kind of different realms does make sense, But then I'm like, but are you absolutely betraying the idea that this is really quite different to other things by grouping them in that way? And then I just let myself off, because you can't be good at everything, But I couldn't remember whether I'd put them into alphabetical order or if they were kind of grouped. And I mean, another interesting thing about the book is I group a lot of things into 6s that you can roll randomly if you want to, but you don't have to at all. But I just thought, if everything is rollable, hey, how cool is that?
I really like that, because there was no instruction of use this randomly, but obviously it was clearly the implication was there if you wanted it, and I really liked that. I thought that was a really nice way of doing it.
And we did a load of randomization in terms of, if you're going on a journey, how many obstacles you have to overcome.
Yeah.
And so that was all randomized, and some were easy, some were a bit tougher, but it was good fun. Yeah,
because you could totally present players with like a bead net map of where they are, and so they know, and each there are a number of beads or knots or whatever, depending on what sort of bead map it is, that tell you if you got
needs to be made.
Yeah. Oh, do you know what? I've made a load of beads out of air giant clay, and I need to. So someone very kindly made me a map. They might listen to this actually, because they're quite a fan. They drew a map for the meat spoiler, but it's a 2D map. And then me being me went, I'm going to make a bead map out of beads and string that has a key, so it is a map, It's quite hard though, because I'm not a Doggerland person, so I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, well, you can make it up, because they've all come out your head, so it's all fine.
one of the things I mentioned after we'd finished our session was that it seems like it's a good fit for one shot, maybe 1 or 2 sessions, but because of the structure of the game, it seems that every game would follow the same pattern, so you come to a village, there's a spirit, there's a problem, and then you have to go to these locations, and the way you go, you deal with things in each location. That's the procedure of playing the game. It feels to me like it's a game that you might only get a few sessions out of. Also, I think it's kind of hard work from a player's point of view. So like we were saying before, it puts a lot on the players.
Mm-hmm.
So I was quite exhausted after playing. I really enjoyed it, but it was hard work. I mean, do you see it as a game you could use for, say, a mini campaign, or was the idea that it's just a one shot and you might have 2 or 3 games of it?
I think you'd probably get, in terms of, I mean, obviously it depends how long your sessions are and all that kind of jazz, but I think in terms of sort of how many stories, if you like, you would run through with it, I think you can get 3 or 4 per witch, and then it's got kind of built into it the elder witch thing that if you start to get too many masks and amulets, then you start to become something different. You stop being an active witch and you start to become an elder witch, and that is sort of the limit within the setting. So no, I totally hear what you're saying. I think there are other things I'm working on at the moment. Actually, there's other scenario sort of structures that you could use. They don't have to quite be the way the meat spoiler is. There's other stuff you could do, but again, because it's so light, so weird, isn't it? It's very structured but very light. It does demand a lot. I came in with that line. Basically, it does demand a lot of the players. It's not. You've got to make your own fun with it, almost. And
I think so. I mean, when we played, so we ran a game of Spire, and I remember talking to Grant Howitt about it, and he was saying, I said, after we played a 3-hour session, he said, I was exhausted. He said, I never play it for 3 hours. I only play 2 hours because 2 hours of that level of intense creativity is enough. You can't do much more than that.
It's quite interesting for me, with the question asked earlier about whether the experimental nature of it is out there for people to find this out almost. And I don't know. Do you know what I mean? I'm really genuinely interested in how that would go with people. It's an interesting one, and I sort of quite like that about it. I don't know the answers to that, to a lot of it.
But that's it's something that comes out in play, isn't it? Really. Just before we move on to art, I just wanted to say, so I really like the campaign frame you put in there about sort of children in the 1970s, or then and the back. I think there's a lot of potential in that. But yeah, that's for the future for me.
I would like to write a campaign that really ties all that together, but it seems quite hard.
You could see a predestined event tracker might jump people back and forth through time.
Exactly. I would love to do that, where you're almost like, let's try not to roll any dice because we need to stay here. And also, oh god, I had a really good discussion about, sorry, I'm totally rambling, but I want to ramble. The idea about the thing about a lot of, especially if you come down to combat, which a lot of role-playing games do. I don't think it's necessarily a huge part of this one, other than the final battle against spirits. But the idea about someone being hurt being the consequence, and it's not meant to necessarily at all be your character. So your characters could be fighting someone and they fail, and a consequence of that is someone is hurt in the scene. It's not your character, right? Which is what my reticence about sort of wound levels and stuff, and I totally hear why it makes sense, especially for a one shot to use them, is because I think it limits. If it's purely narrative, it allows people to freely say, oh, it's your character that's hurt, and then throw the narration to them and they describe it. But something you can do within Silver Road is go, if everyone's like sort of quite hurt because you're playing it that way where everyone's sort of injured, you can just move it on like 6 months. And we had a game where everyone was really, really hurt, so the Maskwitches retreated to their sort of secret base.
I like it.
Blah blah blah.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to be very careful about this because I mean, people who know my Twitter will have seen me go on for the last 6 months. I've gone on quite the crusade about AI art because of my background of I am currently training the next generation of concept artists at university, and we're all very concerned about Midjourney, which is why I was really glad to hear that you approached the whole Midjourney element of the game sort of inspirational experimental springboard for a game idea rather than with the idea of making the sort of completed artwork match the game afterwards. But I was just wondering, because there's a bit in the book where you talk at length about the concept of cultural appropriation and how you really didn't want to do that. And obviously the ethics of Maskwitches is very strong. And that's why I was a bit sort of conflicted about there being some AI imagery in there. And I'm just wondering how you felt about using those AI images as final artwork, especially when you've, previously had, was it Mike Fancino had done the illustration for Silver Road, and his work is obviously spectacular. So I was just wondering how you kind of reconciled what might be seen as a tension between those two things.
So, yeah, I mean, Mike's work in Silver Road was using Midjourney. So Mike introduced me to Midjourney. Now, the interesting thing, I draw a really clear line between when Midjourney was this interesting experimental tool. Yeah, we don't have good words for these things. I mean, this is another cause, of course. Obviously, there's a huge amount of controversy now about it. When I was making Maskwitches and so on, the artwork for it was much, much less so. And as time has moved on, we put out a big statement that we don't use it anymore. Like, I'm remaking all the artwork for Silver Road right now. It's all being remade with sort of models and sets and photography so that it has a very similar feel, but is not using Midjourney. So we kind of moved away from it, but obviously it happened at the time it happened, and it's kind of the physical product is a sort of, it's like a document of that time, if you like. I don't want to kind of destroy that just yet. I think eventually we will replace all the artwork in Maskwitches as well. I think there was it's a very interesting thing how the debate that has occurred around Midjourney is a very interesting one. And again, I'm choosing my words very carefully. Suffice to say, I don't really agree with the dominant narrative around it, because I spent an enormous amount of time studying how it worked before anyone was really talking about it. I'm talking about January last year. So I kind of have my own beliefs about what it's doing, how it's doing it, and the inappropriateness of some of the slogans that have arisen against it. Like that it's theft, for example. I really struggle with that. I understand why that's a slogan that's come to prominence. It's very emotive. It's been very effective. I think factually we will need to wait and see how the class action lawsuits go. And I think some folks might get a bit of a shock there, because I don't think it's as much of a given as they are very vociferously promoting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I think, what's happening with the law around AI, and particularly copyright law, is a very deep and terrifying pool, and it's a lot murkier than people would believe it to be, which is why, it's really great for me to hear that, that you are thinking about potentially, well, you're already replacing some of the artwork in some of your previous stuff, and you might be on this. Because I actually had a proper quandary when Steve said, oh, do you want to play Maskwitches? And I was like, oh, this sounds right up my alley because it's very weird. So let's go and have a look at that. And I bought the game on my mobile, where the cover of the game was about 5 millimeters square. So it wasn't this is one of the few games that I bought without looking at the artwork at all. And I was really quite like, oh my God, I've just supported a game that uses AI artwork, and then had a proper moral quandary about it. But I think it's really great to hear that you're using it as a tool rather than as an end in itself, because I think that's, to me, that will give heart to a lot of my students who, do want to be able to make artwork for tabletop roleplay games, but are concerned, even when small indie producers are sort of rushing towards something like Midjourney, like they are doing at the moment. But I mean, your Kickstarter was only up for like a week, so it's not like you had loads of time to do everything, is it?
Well, it's a really interesting thing where I don't personally. I've never felt in any way threatened by Midjourney. I think it does a very specific thing. Sometimes I'll slip up and call it art. The images that it makes, sometimes I'll slip up and call it art in terms of, the production use of the word art, as in an image in a book, you call the artwork, right? But I don't think it's art in terms of, what humans produce and call art, because it just isn't. It's images, right? And the time that is saved in sort of the production of it, if you like, needs to be spent elsewhere in curation and in using these very random kind of things it throws up, or perhaps more it used to. It's really changed. I mean, Midjourney version 4, I have literally no interest in, even if I didn't have ethical problems with the data sets and all that stuff, which I do. Even if I didn't, it's just a photo faker now. And it's interesting that it's very clearly programmers leading it, and the results are being curated by the community votes on what is good. And it's become a fake photo generator. I'm not interested in that at all. There's just no interest. But there was a point around about version 2, version 3, where it did make these really weird, inexplicably bizarre images. And I thought people couldn't make those, and they had a very limited use because they were so weird. And then, more and more, a few small presses started using it as an artist replacement, which I just thought was stupid. And it looks rubbish, to be honest, in that context. I didn't see it as having much viability in that,
That's the really interesting thing, isn't it? Because, I mean, not to dominate this conversation too much, and I promise, Steve, that I won't go on for this too long.
This is the most highbrow conversation we've ever had on this podcast. In as much highbrow equals intelligent. Let's leave it at that.
But no, I think it's really interesting because I think culturally we're already kind of going full circle on AI art already, and that we started off kind of laughing at it, and then it got a bit serious and a bit scary, and then it got even more terrifying because now it knows exactly how many fingers to put on a human, and we can have all kinds of deep fake stuff. So, the focus is going on to the deep fake stuff. But I just wonder if it's going to be a bit like the use of drone footage in really bad B movies, where it's something that's sort of got a very high production value and is relatively cheap to make and is therefore quite quick. And therefore, all the cheap people are going to be using it.
Yes.
And therefore, everybody's going to be going, oh, yeah, that's really cheap. That's got AI art. I don't, this isn't going to give me the value of what the production value of that kind of AI art looks like. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I'm really glad that Maskwitches, even though the AI is absolutely part of the feel of the game, it's really key to Maskwitches in a way that it's probably not with lots of other stuff. But I'm really glad to see you talk about going back and changing it, because I think that, history is not going to be very kind about that particular era, or in fact sort of Midjourney versions 2 to 5. It might be different when Midjourney gets to like version 7 or something, which will be in 3 weeks time. But right now, just before the machine reaches sentience, and that's the end, basically. Yeah, exactly. But it's just really interesting how this, it's kind of how it became it was an experimental thing for you, and this then becomes sort of quite faddy, and is also a little bit concerning, and obviously ethically quite questionable in terms of scraping and stuff. But like I say, I'm really heartened to hear, and I think my students will be really heartened to hear that you're looking at using it for what it was, and you're sort of moving on and using other stuff in the future, I think.
Yeah, and you know what? It's an interesting thing where it, at the time, we used it, okay? And I want to be really sort of careful around this, because I don't want to be going, oh, we don't use it anymore, so it's fine. I would still I still have to sort of state the case that I think the court cases need to be resolved. And I think that will probably change some of the rhetoric around it. Or will it? I mean, hey, who knows? But as an artist, and I mean sort of capital A artist, if you like, you have to take risks and you have to try new tools. I thought Peter Gabriel was really interesting when he was talking about it recently, that the people, I was reminded through the process that the illustration market can be incredibly conservative. And I was reminded of when, digital art first came about, and a lot of the chat around that. Obviously, there's a different element to do with the ethics of data sets, right? That does makes it very different. But it is quite interesting. Like we made use of it as an interesting thing in the world, and then moved on from it because, of course, I did. If you know what I mean, because it was interesting while it was interesting, and then it stopped being interesting, so I stopped using it. There's also another this is a really gross thing that I'm going to allow myself to say. I did think to myself at one point, for once, as a working illustrator of 25 years, for once, I want to make some money out of it. Instead of going, oh, I'll never use it, and tut at everyone else that uses it, I want to make some money. I want an artist to make some money. I employed 2 other artists full time for several months from the proceeds of it, which I would have some ethical questions for people that don't want to touch any sort of new tools in case they're not, okay. Do you know what I mean? It's like it can be quite complicated.
It is a complicated thing, but I think that, using it as a tool, I reckon is probably okay, in the same way that we all stand on the shoulders of giants as artists. None of us have invented perspective. So, surely it's okay for us to use sort of new technical tools as well. But I think it's really great for you to talk about it in terms of the data mining and the use as being 2 different ethical questions, and this is a good way of separating artists from technology, or artists from other bits and pieces.
I've learned something which I didn't expect to, but that's good.
It's really interesting.
It is fantastically interesting, I think, and I mean, it's really nice to talk about it. It's really nice to talk to you about it, Kay, because I stopped talking about it online because the discourse became so sort of online, where it was just like, no, it's this. And you go, no, but it isn't, though, in terms of, like, I have ethical issues about the way the data was gathered to use, but I question whether the results are actually copyright infringement any more than when I'm doing a commercial art job and I pull up a Google image search and I look at those images that are owned by people, and none of what is in those images appear in my final artwork, but I have made commercial use of those images by looking at them. And there's a parallel there with the AI stuff. I mean, and I tell you what, a really good shortcut for me was I stopped being happy with the way it turned into a money-making subscription tool. It was no longer a research thing. Because when we first started, it was very much, what can this do? What's it for? Can you use it for something? I don't mean, can you use it in terms of legality, but can these images mean anything? And we've moved on so far from there now.
Who knew that things that people use a lot tend to get monetized?
But it slid into that so quickly, alongside suddenly the community were voting on which images were good images. And I was thinking, well, nothing I make is ever going to be, with Midjourney, is ever going to be voted on as good, because it's like horrific and really upsetting. A lot of it. Yeah, I mean, it's good.
I suppose when you're moving into, I'm not an artist, clearly, but in terms of how you produce art for, you obviously trying to get a similar look, but you're going to do that in a different way, obviously.
Yeah. And I'm having a brilliant time. It's great.
Happy days, because that aesthetic is really strong, and that's one of the things that certainly drew me into the Kickstarter early on. Was well, you had me at Doggerland, and then wow, weird art, fantastic. I'm all over that as well. So obviously, the Kickstarter came out. It was remarkable. I think you expected to make £500, and you made 28,000, whatever it was.
22, yeah,
22, yeah. So a good amount there. So there's a future, obviously, for Maskwitches, and then do you want to tell us a little bit about what's coming for Maskwitches, and then you can touch on Stonehenge as well, because that's equally
So we've got another book I'm finishing off just now. Is we're calling it a journey book, which is and it's called To the Ice Caves, and it presents basically a string of different types of terrain that you might encounter as part of the story, part of your stories, with loads of ideas for obstacles for each type of terrain.
That'd be really useful.
There might be. I've just realised I might just put a massive index in the back of every single consequence I can think of, which is sort of what I'm doing to write the individual terrain obstacles, and I think that might be useful for people, because I think there is a lot more to it. Depending on how creative your consequences are, it changes the nature of the game very much.
That's something that would be really useful at the table. Just something just to
just dip into it. You can go, oh shit, I need an obstacle. And here's all the consequences. I can, and you'll be able to really dip in and out of that. That will be the last Maskwitches book that uses the AI stuff. That's all been pre-generated, and then we'll go back to the core book, I suspect, and figure out exactly how we're going to do that. It'll probably involve a lot of models. Again, I have a background as a model maker. Anyway, and then moving forward beyond that, I anticipate we will do some more Maskwitches books. I'd like to do some more scenarios, and I'd like to do other journey books than what we've got in this first one. But then then it's really full steam ahead on Maskwitches 2 at the moment, which is sort of it moves the timeline forward. And
obviously I've seen the video online talking about Stonehenge or Maskwitches 2. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that, and interesting, the video that's online is all models. There's no AI in that video at all. It's all model. So that is all about the movement forward into the Neolithic period. I mean, as useful as these sort of fuzzy historical terms are, they're falling out of fashion these days. But fast forward, I didn't want to make a game about the Neolithic, because in the Neolithic you have agriculture, which leads to sort of surplus, which leads to the hoarding of wealth, which leads to things like war. I mean, war was almost invented in the Neolithic period as a result of agriculture, if you like. I mean, you could put some historians in the room, they'll argue about that. But it's and kind of organized religion starts to come about, and the building of these great stone monuments like Stonehenge and so on. And I didn't really want to, it just didn't fill me with glee. That it all seemed quite almost unpleasant. You know what I mean? You can't, the fantasy, if you like, is not there for me in that setting. But then I read a little bit about the spread of agriculture into the British Isles, and it was quite halting, and it has these pauses. And I kind of figured, what if the Maskwitches organization survives? They survived Doggerland, and takes root in the British Isles, and then eventually becomes a sort of resistance movement to agriculture and what's called the Neolithic package of agriculture, pottery, and all that. And they're resisting it, trying to hold on to this hunter-gatherer way of life, and prevent the building of Stonehenge. So it's almost more like a little campaign. It is going to be a standalone game, but it's going to be even more structured, where you will, as a team of Maskwitches, now allied with the spirits who have found common ground in the fact you're all going to be, if Stonehenge gets built, it's over for the Maskwitches. That ends all their powers. It ends all the spirits. The farmers, or what do they call, the milk drinkers and the grain eaters, want to stop all that. And you're trying to stop them.
It's guerrilla warfare and resistance.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Which, and it'll be a bit more grim. It'll be a bit more. You will be fighting other humans, which is kind of something that you absolutely do not do in the verdant pastoral fantasy. It's not pastoral because that's agricultural, but the sort of Rousseau fantasy of hunter gatherers that is Maskwitches. It'll be a bit grimmer. I thought I really like the idea that we know Doggerland goes under the water, so there's an end cap, if you like, on the stories within Doggerland. And I realised, of course, Stonehenge gets built, so it's another doomed enterprise that you'll be playing out a story that will not necessarily have a happy ending. But then I discovered that I didn't know this at all when I started. Stonehenge actually fell apart shortly after it was built. It was made in quite a shoddy way, and the central stones fell over very early on.
It was rebuilt, wasn't it?
Fell over or pushed. Do you know what I mean? So maybe the Maskwitches, were actually more successful than I initially thought.
Maybe and then I also in some way.
Yeah,
but I do have to ask though. Sorry to interrupt, John. But just before you go and talk about anything else, I have to ask, if we're gonna have Maskwitches going up, against the milk drinkers, etc., is there a potential then for spiritual warfare using the spirits on your side?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Excellent.
And I imagine it will just be really sort of Apocalypse Now trippy, like that sort of business. I have to be careful. At the moment, I'm deep in the weeds of. I do not want to make a game where the indigenous people of the country fight immigrants.
I see where you're coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, and it needs some careful. I can do it. I believe I can do it. I can be framed properly so it's not, some sort of weird fascist thing, because that's like the opposite of what I'm trying to achieve. but you suddenly go, oh God, because of course agriculture as well comes from the Middle East. You got like, oh, and they're
It's
Middle
ideas, though,
Eastern.
isn't it? Although, yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. Just got to be a bit careful.
I've got confidence in you, John. You'll get it.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can do it. We'll get there. And be good. The other exciting thing that I thought of was perhaps if the Maskwitches cannot stop the stones being brought to Stonehenge, because it's sort of fascinating. The builders of Stonehenge take apart. They take apart a pre-existing henge in Wales and move it. And all that. There's loads to sort of be excited about and all that. But maybe once they fail, they sort of hijack a little bit of the power of Stonehenge to transport themselves back through time to Doggerland, where they found the Maskwitches order in Doggerland, and it's just a big circle. The whole thing just goes round and round. And I just thought, oh yeah, come on, that's great. So I'm quite excited about it.
Yeah, I can tell.
Sounds great.
It does sound good. So in terms of timescales, because I was going to ask you this, because the Journey to the Ice Caves, is that something that's going to be? When do you reckon that's going to be out and about?
I'd really like to get that done in the next 2 weeks, to be honest with you. I think that's probably really I'm just filling in the last bits of writing, so it's so close, but it's also been so close for about 2 months, and
I'd like
just
to buy a
stuff
copy
keeps
at
happening.
Expo. If you could sort that out, that'd be great.
Yeah, I reckon that's not entirely out. I've cursed myself now, but yeah, it should be doable. So yeah, and then I don't know on Maskwitches 2, which also needs a name, because the code name Maskwitches 2 F Stonehenge isn't really viable.
It doesn't.
Or Maskwitches 2 Electric Boogaloo was the other. But yeah, it needs a proper name, which could take me months, and it there's so much to figure out. Just conceptually, there's so much to figure out for Maskwitches 2, but it's all there to play for. I'm really excited about it.
It's been
cool.
Lovely to speak to you, John, and to hear your enthusiasm. I mean, Maskwitches is great. I think so I'm really at Expo, and it'll be interesting to see how it gets received, even with my heretical sort of additions to it in terms of wound levels and that sort of thing.
Absolutely disgusting.
I like to offend every designer we get on this podcast at some point.
They deserve it.
No, just thanks for your time, John. It's been really interesting to listen to all of this.
Absolutely.
Oh, good.
And maybe when Stonehenge 2 or Maskwitches 2 comes a little bit closer, maybe we can get you on again, and you can tell us a little bit more about how you solved the conundrum around it.
Yeah, it's quite exciting, isn't it? That I don't know at the moment. At this point in time, I have no idea.
All will become clear. The Maskwitches they'll share their knowledge with you, and all will become clear. Right. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks again, John, for the time, and take it easy. Cool. Thanks very much, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to another exploration of my gaming vexes. If you've got any thoughts you'd like to add to what you've heard here, or a gaming vex of your own you'd like to offer up for discussion, you can contact me on Twitter @AllAnthar, or you can leave a voice message. The link's on the podcast webpage on Anchor, or can be found in the show notes. Until the next time, may all your games be free of vexatiousness, and be excellent to each other, always.